This is Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, a ghost story by M.R. James, retold for you this winter's night as part of my Christmas series here on the Wanderlust Way. Settle in, let the room grow still, and allow the story to unfold. There are some people who seem perfectly armoured against the uncanny. They live by reason alone and will accept only what can be weighed, measured and catalogued. Such a man was Professor Parkins of Cambridge. He was young, clever and rather proud of his own clear-headedness. His subject was obscure and specialised, and he liked it that way. He disliked superstition in all its forms, and was more than willing, if encouraged, to say so at length. It was during a winter term that Parkins announced his intention of spending a short golfing holiday at the east coast town of Burnstow. At dinner in college, he mentioned his plans to a small company of colleagues. "A few days by the sea," he said, "with no duties except to improve my rather indifferent game. I shall stay at the Globe Inn, decent rooms I'm told, and the links are within easy reach." One of the older men at the table, a quiet scholar with archaeological interests, looked up. "The Globe, is it?" he said. "Then you'll be very near a Templar's preceptory, or what is left of it. I wonder whether you'd do me a small kindness, Parkins. Walk out and look at the place, and tell me whether you think it's worth a proper excavation." Parkins, who liked to be useful when it cost him nothing, readily agreed. "You shall have a full report," he said, "but I must warn you, I don't promise to see ghosts of crusaders striding about the dunes." "There are other things in old grounds besides ghosts," his colleague returned mildly. "Foundations, pottery, bits of metal, that sort of thing." The talk drifted on. Someone asked Parkins whether he wasn't nervous of staying alone in an old inn on a bleak stretch of coast in winter. "My dear fellow," he replied, "if the place is draughty, I shall ring the bell. If it's lonely, I shall enjoy the quiet. As for anything more imaginative, I leave that to you." And so the matter rested. A few days later, Parkins arrived at Burnstow. The sea lay grey and restless beside the town, and the wind off the water had a keen edge to it. The Globe Inn proved to be a solid, rather old-fashioned building, its passages smelling faintly of coal dust and sea air. The landlady showed him to his room. It was large and comfortable, with a fire laid, a writing table near the window and, something that ruffled him a little, 2 beds. "I had asked for a single room," he said. "It is a single room, sir," the landlady answered, "but there happens to be 2 beds in it. We're rather full just now." Parkins frowned. "As long as I'm not expected to share it." "Oh, no, sir, this room is for you alone." She hesitated. "We did wonder, though, whether another gentleman might wish to join you later in the week. But if you'd prefer—" "I most certainly would prefer to remain by myself," Parkins said firmly. The matter was adjusted. He unpacked, arranged his books and papers, and, feeling pleased with the arrangements, went down to take a walk and look at the links before dark. The next day followed a very pleasant pattern. A round of golf in the crisp morning air, a good luncheon, and then, armed with directions given by his archaeological colleague, Parkins set out along the shore to look for the ruins of the Templars' preceptory. The coast there was a line of low cliffs and shingles, the sea gnawing steadily at the land. After some distance he found a track leading inland, then a scatter of old stones on a slight rise, a few courses of wall, a hint of a doorway, and heaps of turf-covered rubble. "This must be the place," he said to himself. There was not much to see at first glance, but Parkins was thorough. He walked slowly around the area, noting the broken outlines, the way the ground sloped, the pattern of the remaining stones. Near what might once have been a corner of the chapel, something caught his eye. In the turf was a small hollow, as if a stone had been removed. Parkins stooped and began to clear away the earth and roots with his stick. Presently, his fingers met something hard and smooth. He drew out a small metal object, caked with soil. It was a whistle. Bronze, he thought, though dulled by age, about the length of his thumb, with a ring at one end and a narrow mouthpiece at the other. Templar period, I presume, he murmured, pleased with his discovery. My friend will be delighted to have something tangible for once. He cleaned off as much dirt as he could with his handkerchief, then slipped the whistle into his pocket and turned back toward the sea. As he walked along the beach, the daylight already beginning to thin, he had the odd sensation of not being entirely alone. Once or twice he glanced back and saw, far along the shore, a small dark figure, someone walking in the same direction but never seeming to gain on him. At another time he might not have been even noticed, but the open coast and the fading light gave the sight a slight uneasiness. Another holiday maker, he said briskly, and walked on. That evening, after dinner at the Globe, he went up to his room, drew the curtains, and settled himself at the table with the whistle. In the better light he could examine it more closely. The metal was dull but sound, the mouthpiece unbroken. Along the flattened side were markings, letters very small and worn. He held it closer to the lamp. On one side the characters were so compressed that he could not at once make them out. On the other they were clearer. Quis est is qui venit. Parkins's Latin was more than equal to this. Who is this? Who is coming? He translated aloud. A strange motto for a whistle. He turned the object in his fingers, amused and intrigued. Doubtless some pious device, he said, meant to recall the Last Judgment, or perhaps it was nothing more than the whim of the maker. Still, the phrase lingered oddly in his mind. He hesitated for a moment, then raised the whistle to his lips. The sound it produced was not loud, but it had an odd quality, a sort of thin, far-off note that seemed less to fill the room than to pass through it, as if it had come from a great distance and were going on to a greater. As the last trace of it died away, Parkins became aware of the wind outside. It had risen suddenly. He could hear it pressing and scraping at the windows, worrying at the corners of the old building. Coincidence, he told himself. Yet he found somewhat unreasonably that he did not care to blow the whistle a second time. Instead, he laid it on the table, extinguished one of the candles and prepared to go to bed. As he did so, he crossed to the window, intending to fasten it more securely against the wind. Looking out, he saw something. The long pale line of the beach and the darker strip of sea beyond. And there on the margin, where the shingle met the sand, he thought he could distinguish a small, solitary figure, standing perfectly still and facing the inn. He leaned closer to the glass. The figure did not move. Some fisherman or late walker, he said, though he wondered what anyone would be doing out there at that hour in such a wind. He drew the curtains firmly and returned to the room. Sleep did not come quickly. When at last he drifted into it, his dreams were troubled. He saw again and again a man running desperately along the beach, stumbling over the groins and ridges, constantly looking behind him. And always, somewhere just out of clear sight, something followed. Not with the long stride of a man, but with a strange fluttering movement, covering the ground with dreadful speed. He woke once, his heart pounding, certain that some noise in the room had roused him. A rapid scurrying sound on the floor, as if something fleeting across the boards. He lit a match and saw nothing. Perhaps, he thought, rats disturbed by the wind. The night wore on. At last, exhausted, he fell into a deeper sleep. In the morning, the maid who came to attend to the fire in the room paused at the door. "Beg pardon, sir," she said, but I thought this was a single gentleman's room." "So it is," Parkins answered, adjusting his glasses. "Well, sir," she hesitated, clearly embarrassed. "Both beds have been slept in?" "Nonsense," said Parkins. "I certainly did not use the other." But when he looked, he saw that the second bed, the one he had taken care not to disturb, was indeed disordered. The clothes were crumpled and dragged sideways, almost, he thought, as if someone had been kneeling or crouching on it, rather than lying down. "It must have been you, sir, in your sleep," the maid suggested, though her tone made it clear she did not herself believe this. "I am not in the habit of leaping from one bed to another in the night," Parkins replied sharply. "Put it straight, if you please, and let us say no more about it." But the incident left him thoughtful. That day he went out to the links with Colonel Wilson, a bluff, outspoken man who was also staying at the Globe. As they walked between holes, talk turned, as it will, on curious finds and old ruins, and Parkins mentioned the whistle. You found it on the Templar ground," the Colonel said. "Well, I don't like the sound of that. Those old fellas were not always up to good, you know. If I were you, I'd be wary of meddling with their odds and ends." "My dear Colonel," said Parkins, "you do not imagine that a piece of metal, however old, can exert any influence beyond its physical properties?" "You're the scholar," the Colonel admitted. "But for my part, I wouldn't be blowing mysterious whistles dug up from church land." They parted amicably enough, each unconvinced by the other. As Parkins and the Colonel approached the inn later that afternoon, they saw a small boy tearing down the road from the direction of the Globe, white-faced and sobbing. "What's this?" cried Wilson, catching the boy by the shoulder. "What's the matter, my lad?" The boy could barely speak for fright. "It were in the window, sir," he gasped. "In one of them upstairs rooms, a kind of white thing waving at me. All pulled out long like it were made of linen. I never see the face, didn't want to. Oh, let me go." He broke free and ran on, leaving the two men staring at each other. "Which window?" the Colonel demanded. The boy pointed up, babbling something about "the second from the corner," before disappearing around the bend. Parkins followed the direction of his finger. His heart gave an unwelcome jolt. The window in question was his own. "The child has frightened himself," he said, more stiffly than usual. "Some curtain blowing in the draught, no doubt." Curtains don't lean out and wave," the Colonel muttered. "We'll look into this." But when they went up to Parkins's room, they found the door locked as he had left it. Inside, nothing seemed amiss, except that the second bed, which the maid had so carefully remade, was once again in a state of wild disorder. Colonel Wilson stared at it. "Parkins," he said slowly, "you had better not spend another night in this room alone." "My dear Colonel," Parkins began, with what he hoped was his usual firmness, "I cannot accept." But the words did not come easily. Something in the sight of that crushed and twisted bedclothes, and in the memory of the boy's terrified face, disturbed him more deeply than he cared to admit. "I shall be perfectly all right," he finished. "There is nothing here that cannot be explained." "Well, if you say so," the Colonel replied. "But if you need me tonight, don't waste time knocking. Just shout." That evening Parkins found himself strangely reluctant to go up to his room. He prolonged his time in the public rooms of the inn, talking with other guests, reading the papers, playing a game of billiards. At last the landlord began to put out lamps, and he could delay no longer. In the room he lit both candles and stirred the fire into a brighter blaze. He picked up a book, determined to occupy his thoughts with sensible reading, until he grew sleepy. The second bed stood in the farther corner between the door and the window. The maid had once more done her best with it. but the queer impression remained of a place that had been disturbed by something that did not lie down in the ordinary way. To shut it out, Parkins improvised a kind of screen, dragging the wardrobe a little and pinning a blanket so that it hung between his own bed and the other. It looked foolish, but it made him feel easier. At length he put his book aside, undressed quickly, and got into bed, leaving one candle burning. Perhaps it was the wind, or the steady pounding of the sea, or the strain of refusing to be frightened, but his sleep, when it came, was thin and uneasy. Sometime deep in the night he woke with a violent start. There had been a sound, a heavy flapping, as of something soft collapsing. The improvised screen he had made, it had fallen to the floor. He sat up. The candle beside him had guttered low, but there was still enough light to see the outlines of the room. On the far side, the second bed was no longer an empty shape in shadow. Something was sitting up in it. For a moment he thought it might be a trick of the crumpled bedclothes. Then the thing moved. It raised itself higher as if struggling out of a tight wrapping. The mass of sheets and blankets seemed to swell and lift, folding and unfolding with a dreadful fumbling motion. Every hair on Parkins's body rose. The figure, if figure it was, began to slide out of the bed, not as a person would rise, but as if the whole heap of linen were somehow animated from within. He scrambled out on the far side of his own bed, putting it between himself and that noiseless, creeping thing. His hand went blindly for the candle, knocking it over so that for a second the flame flared and then straightened, throwing a clearer light. The thing in the middle of the room was now upright. It stood between him and the door, arms spread wide as though to bar his escape. Parkins stared, unable to cry out. The arms were nothing but hanging folds of cloth streaming down to the floor. The head was at first only a knob of gathered linen. Then as he watched, the folds pressed and puckered inward, drawing themselves into something like features. 2 hollows deepened where eyes should have been. The suggestion of a mouth pulled and worked beneath. It was as if the bedclothes themselves were trying to remember the shape of a face, and almost succeeding. He could bear it no longer. A hoarse, involuntary cry broke from his throat. At the sound, the thing turned fully toward him. It lurched forward with a horrible, fluttering swiftness, the empty folds stretching out as if to enfold him. He backed away until he felt the cold glass of the window against his shoulders. For an instant, the crumpled linen face was so very close to his own. There was no breath, no warmth, only the suffocating nearness of cloth that somehow was not quite cloth. Then, just as the darkness of it seemed about to close over him, the door burst open. Colonel Wilson sprang into the room, lamp in one hand and a stick in the other. "Parkins!" At the rush of light and movement, the thing seemed to sag. It collapsed upon itself suddenly and fell in a heap on the floor, nothing now but a tangle of sheets and blankets. Parkins slid down against the wall, half fainting, while the colonel strode forward and kicked at the pile with grim determination. There was no resistance, only linen. A few minutes later, other guests and the landlord arrived, roused by the noise. Between them they got Parkins back to bed, his own bed, and they did not leave him until he was calm enough to speak. In the cold grey light of morning, the bedclothes from the second bed were taken away and burned. The whistle, at the colonel's insistence, was carried down to the shore and hurled far into the sea, where the waves took it without ceremony. Professor Parkins returned to Cambridge rather sooner than he had planned. His views on the supernatural were, if not entirely altered, no longer offered quite so readily nor with quite such certainty as before. He never again spoke willingly of his visit to the Templars' preceptory or of the lonely East Coast room with 2 beds. And if, on some wild winter night, the wind rises suddenly about a seaside inn, and the curtains billow as though something were pressing to get in or out, well, that is the sort of thing best left unexplored. After all, there are questions it is wiser not to ask, especially when one has already heard the answer to, who is this? Who is coming?